Howdy gamers, how's it going? Jester back at it again with another dogshit video. And this is something I have wanted to talk about quite a bit, and it's also going to lead into quite a few things. And that's Linux versus Windows. Okay, so I recently went on this thing where I've been using Linux a hell of a lot. Specifically Linux Mint. And I wanted to kind of talk about a lot of preconceived stuff I had about it and what was proved wrong in it. And what I genuinely don't like by a lot of people, and I want to go ahead and start off with saying that so many people, when they hear the word Linux, or they hear that someone's in a Linux operating system, you assume that they are doing some very ridiculous things, and they're essentially a power user of their operating system. And the fact that they need extremely deliberate control over everything they do, they need to have a highly complex and highly convoluted operating system to do very specific tasks, and that is not true, like, at fucking all. While Linux absolutely has the capabilities of doing that, I feel like everyone that thinks of Linux is thinking of Arch Linux. Like, that's somehow the public's preconceived notion of what Linux is like. And Arch Linux is essentially this thing that people who want to be a power user in Linux and want this ridiculously convoluted thing that can do anything you want use. But that's in reality very little of the actual Linux distributions. What Linux actually does is it has distributions, or distros is what they're called most commonly. And there's a whole bunch of different ones, and they all do different things really well. And there's even ones that do what Windows does really well. And that's what the one I've been using. It's Linux Mint. Linux Mint is a Linux distribution which is incredibly effective at being a better Windows. And I think a lot of people are very scared to give Linux a shot. It's also one of the things that I hear a lot, because they're like, oh, it's going to be so difficult, I don't want to take the next week in to figure out how Linux works. And that's honestly kind of bullshit, because I think for me, learning Linux Mint was way easier than learning, like, whenever a new Windows comes out. It was easier for me to learn Linux Mint than it was to learn Windows 10, because it has all of the capabilities Windows 10 does, every other Windows operating system does, and more, and it does it far simpler. There are different Linux distributions that can do what Windows does far simpler, and this is the number one reason, I think, above all else. That's something I just want to prove that isn't true. I've learned that it's really easy to learn. There's distributions that are very friendly to not being a power user, just doing everyday stuff. But this is the number one thing I wish people talked about more, and that's Linux makes your computer like 10 times fucking faster. I'm exaggerating, but whenever you install a Linux distribution, you're going to notice that your computer's going like 3 to 5 times faster. It's like you bought a high-end top computer, especially if you're using old hardware. Now, if you're using very new high-end hardware, you're probably not going to notice the speed limitations that Windows has or how slow it does certain things. Like, you're not going to notice it as much, but you're still going to definitely notice an improvement. And what I think the problem with Windows is that you'll notice like a weird hardware slowdown, which is supposed to be illegal, right? When you buy a computer, okay, let's say you buy a fucking cup, right? You've got a cup of water, okay? If I bought this same cup of water 10 years ago, hypothetically, it's going to be just as good as a cup of water. However, the Windows thing is that, like, every year or so, or 6 months, there's just gonna be holes punched in it, right? And it's gonna be shittier at holding water. That's just a dog shit analogy, but hopefully you know what I mean, right? If you had an old computer, you'll realize 10 years ago it used to be really fast. Not just fast because there's nothing else to compare it to, but it's significantly slowed down since you bought it, even though you're still using like Windows 7. And it doesn't make any sense. And the information on why it does that isn't public, and it can't be public because it's just illegal for them to do that. So the reasoning behind it is kind of shaky. But you'll notice, especially when you're using older hardware, that Linux is going to make it feel like you bought an entirely new fucking computer. And it's not something that slows down. Linux is meant to be very fast and very friendly no matter what you're using. And even if you are using a kind of nicer computer like I'm using now, you're going to notice improvements. Like, rendering videos for me is going 2 times as fast. Editing is way faster. Anything I want to do is way easier. And that's like so against what I had going into it. I went into Linux thinking, oh, all of this is going to be extremely confusing. It's going to be harder to use. Genuinely, normal tasks are going to be far more difficult than they used to be on Windows, but I really want to give this a shot, and it's been such the fucking opposite experience, and I'm so happy about it, because I've been such a big advocate on open source software for a really long time, but it's only been recently I've delved into this whole fucking Linux thing. I'm so goddamn happy that I was wrong, and that it's such this welcoming thing, and the community for it is fucking amazing. if you want to know how to do anything, there are so many people that are so willing to help out. And something I want to talk about too is there's also a thing where people think gaming on Linux is objectively worse than Windows. And for, I think, until about this year, that was true. But we are on the precipice of Linux gaming. It's so fucking good right now. In fact, a lot of games right now are running faster on Linux, or just as fast. You're not noticing a slowdown at all. There's been such amazing support. Like, almost all the Steam games you play, Steam now has support to run those in Linux. A lot of things can be easily brought over. And there's also a program on Linux called Winetricks, which essentially allows you to run Windows EXEs on Linux, and you will notice almost no slowdown at all, which is really good, especially if you play any competitive games. I would like to say too that to make sure I wasn't on this honeymoon high off of using Linux, I was like, okay, I'm going to force myself to learn. And it turned out to be really easy. So I forced myself to only use Linux for about 3 weeks. And then I'm like, okay, I want to make sure that I wasn't just overly enthusiastic about Linux and trying something new, because I can kind of do that sometimes. So I'm like, okay, I'm going to go back to Windows for a couple of weeks and see if I'm like, I kind of like being Windows, like I miss being at home, and like maybe that speed up, that was some sort of thing I was saying mentally. It's like, no, ever since I'm just about to go back to Linux, I forced myself to only use Windows for 2 weeks, and I wanted to get back to Linux so bad. When I was using Linux, I was in love, but now that I forced myself to use Windows again to see if I was really forcing myself to like Linux, I've noticed that I just love Linux. There's so much in Windows now that pisses me off. There's so much shit Windows does now that makes me want to punch my monitor and get back into Linux. But thankfully now I'm done with that test where I was using Linux for about a month and I forced myself to use Windows for about a month, and I've noticed that Linux is objectively better. Usually I just end these videos with, alright, thanks gamers, have a good one, but I'd like to shout out someone called Linux for Everyone. This has been a channel that I have fell in love with recently, and I followed him for a couple of months now, and his channel's starting to blow up. I'm going to link his stuff in the description and in the pinned comment. I think he's really someone who's a big advocate for pushing that Linux is not this power user thing. It's something that everyone should be using. It's not just like, oh, I'm upset with Windows right now. It's just Linux is such an objectively better experience that if you are not giving it a shot, you're fucking yourself up. And also, going over to Linux from Windows, not only is it fucking free, it is really easy, and there will be guides about that soon. So, that's about it though, gamers. Have a good one.